Putin's Mad Max-style assault attempt in Pokrovsk ended in a major disaster. This is not a military vehicle convoy, but a convoy of desperation. These images clearly show that road to Pokrovsk, that death corridor. Old Soviet Bukhanka minibuses, off-road motorcycles, and soldiers who thought they were hidden in the thick fog. The Kremlin's generals decided to infiltrate Pokrovsk using this Mad Max tactic. But there was one thing they didn't know. The fog couldn't hide the heat of the engines. Ukraine's Hornets drones were waiting with thermal cameras, and the Russian forces' desperate assault would turn into a disaster in seconds. This fiasco sealed the real disaster, namely the reality of 25,000 Russian casualties in a month, as announced by President Zelensky. On the morning of November 10, 2025, a thick layer of fog covered the southern suburbs of Pokrovsk. This was seen not as a weakness, but as an opportunity for the Russian command. After months of heavy mechanized assaults and human waves, which cost the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers being shattered by FPV drones, the Kremlin's generals put a new plan into action. This plan, in one of the most brutal wars of the 21st century, seemed to have sprung not from military doctrine books, but from the set of a post-apocalyptic film. The plan was called Mad Max. At its core were speed, fog, and desperation. The Russian tactic was a painful manifestation of the theme of logistical strangulation. The heavy-armored, mechanized fist strategy had failed against Ukraine's precise and inexpensive FPV drones. Armored vehicles were hunted down one by one before reaching the front lines. Instead, the Russians gambled on speed and invisibility. Instead of heavy tanks and BMPs, they opted for off-road motorcycles and outdated UAZ-452 minibuses from the Soviet era, known as Bukhankas. This choice of vehicles was not accidental. It was a sign of the Russian army's vehicle shortage and logistical collapse. Their goal was simple. They believed that dense fog would blind Ukraine's optical sensor drones, the eyes in the sky. Within this fog, fast motorcycles and small minibuses would infiltrate deep into Ukrainian lines, bypass defense lines, and create chaos inside. In theory, this could have appeared to be a brilliant asymmetric move aimed at circumventing the FPV threat. However, this plan collided with the reality of technological asymmetry and shattered. On the Ukrainian side, the Dovbush's Hornets, unmanned systems battalion, attached to the 68th Oleksa Dovbush Independent Jaeger Regiment, was monitoring the skies. The moment the Russian infiltration attempt began, the Hornets went on high alert. But there was one critical technology the Russian command had not accounted for: advanced thermal cameras. The Russians correctly calculated that fog would blind optical sensors, i.e., normal cameras. However, thermal cameras integrated into FPV drones are sensitive to heat, not light. This jargon means fog could not hide the heat of a motorcycle's running engine or the body heat of soldiers inside a minibus. The fog the Russians relied on was not an invisibility cloak that suddenly made them invisible, but a deadly trap that ensnared them. OSINT images published by Dovbush's Hornets and shared on platforms like Charter 97 fit the description of a high-tension scene. In the images, white-hot spots detected by thermal cameras in the dense fog, Russian motorcycles and Bukhanka minibuses, were visible. FPV drones locked onto these targets one by one. The result was complete destruction. These images capture a close-up of this tragedy. You are watching the fate of a Russian unit advancing under the very fog cover they trusted, on the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk. The only thing left behind from the failed attack attempt is burned-out vehicles. The footage shows charred, burned-out motorcycles, simple military vehicles, and civilian cars scattered every 5 to 10 meters along the road at the southern entrance to Pokrovsk. Another published video clearly showed at least 6 motorcycles engulfed in flames, soldiers jumping from the vehicles and fleeing in panic toward the fog. According to an analysis by the Kyiv Post, footage from the 4th National Guard Rubizh Regiment dated November 9th, i.e., recordings from the day before, confirmed the systematic destruction along the same route. Allegedly, in early November, Russian soldiers entered the center of Pokrovsk and seized the Pokrovsk City Council building, the administrative heart of the city. This would have been a symbolic victory moment desperately needed by the Kremlin. A Russian flag hoisted on that building would have been proof of success that Putin could show the Russian people on the evening news, saying, "Look, we are winning." But then what happened? This is what happened. These images you see were published by military analyst Chuck Pafara, and these images were verified by the Kyiv Independent. These are soldiers from Ukraine's 425th Separate Assault Regiment, an elite unit codenamed Skelia. Just hours after the Russians' "We've conquered it" announcement, that propaganda victory, these men returned to the building. In the city center, amid scattered clashes, they launched an operation at the very spot the Russians claimed to control. And this is the moment the 425th Regiment raised the Ukrainian flag once again atop that building, right in the heart of Russian propaganda. This is not just a building, it is a symbol. All the images you have seen so far are the most concrete evidence of how that ingenious infiltration attempt turned into an embarrassing fiasco for Russia. Putin's generals knowingly sent their soldiers on this death march. This shows that Putin has lost touch with reality on the ground, that his generals are afraid to tell him the truth, and that the lives of Russian soldiers have no value to the Kremlin. The Russians' major Pokrovsk offensive ended in a major disaster. So why motorcycles? Why civilian vehicles? Pafara gives a clear answer with a specific number. Russia lost more than 5,000 military trucks in this invasion, which it calls a special military operation. 5,000 trucks. This means the Kremlin cannot feed its army. This situation has left Russian soldiers dependent on motorcycles, civilian cars, sand trucks, and even handcarts to transport supplies. Contrary to Putin's Second Great Army propaganda, the Russian people are seeing how their soldiers are forced to travel to the front lines using primitive methods. For Putin, this shameful picture is proof of how Western sanctions and Ukrainian resistance have eroded his military machine from within. This MAX fiasco on November 10th was just the tip of the iceberg. To understand the why behind this desperate motorcycle attack, one need only rewind time a few days. At the heart of this collapse lies a single number: 25,000. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a statement that shook the course of the war. He announced that during October alone, on a single front, namely in the Pokrovsk direction, the Russian army had lost 25,000 soldiers. This figure, beyond being a propaganda statement, stands as the highest monthly loss recorded since the full-scale invasion began. It was a catastrophe that overshadowed even the meat grinder days in Bakhmut, vaporizing nearly an entire army in a single month. Cross-verifying this claim is critically important. This is not just Zelensky's claim. Independent OSINT analysts, such as the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, corroborated this claim in their November 10th assessment, stating that Russian offensive operations in eastern Ukraine have likely resulted in some of the highest Russian casualty rates since the start of the invasion. ISW confirmed that Russia has suffered exceptionally high troop losses. This shows that the 25,000-strong toll is a painful reality that shakes the Kremlin's propaganda walls. There is a timeline leading to this collapse. It all began with the fall of Avdiivka in February 2024. After capturing Avdiivka, the Russian army set its sights on the next major strategic target, Pokrovsk. However, according to BBC analysis, this advance was extremely slow and costly. By 2025, Russian forces had advanced only 40 kilometers in 25 months. This sluggishness frustrated the Kremlin, and Putin ordered a massive build-up to create a breakthrough. In October 2025, a huge force was amassed in the region for this breakthrough operation. According to intelligence reports verified by the New York Post and United 24 media, between 150,000 and 170,000 Russian troops were gathered on the Pokrovsk front. This was a build-up equivalent to the forces at the start of the invasion. However, this massive force was deployed not with modern military strategy, but with the most brutal tactic of the Soviet era: human wave. Throughout October, this 170,000-strong build-up was ruthlessly used to break through the Pokrovsk defense. According to ISW reports, over 220 major assaults were launched in October. In the 24-hour period spanning November 9th to 10th alone, 97 separate clashes were recorded in the Pokrovsk direction. Russian commanders hoped to breach Ukraine's defensive lines by sending troops forward until their ammunition ran out. However, this tactic was defeated by technology. 25,000 soldiers evaporated in the muddy fields of Pokrovsk. By the end of October, when the human wave doctrine failed, the only option left was the desperate Mad Max infiltration on November 10th. The fundamental question here is, why would Vladimir Putin risk throwing 25,000 soldiers into a meat grinder in a single month? Why resort to such desperate, tragicomic and suicidal tactics like Mad Max? The answer lies in Pokrovsk's geographical location and strategic importance. Pokrovsk is not just a dot on the map. It is the keystone of Ukraine's entire Donbass defense. It is the gateway to Donbass. Pokrovsk's real importance is not military, but logistical. This city is the last major railway and highway junction in the Donbass, still under Ukrainian control. The main supply line feeding the Ukrainian garrisons in Kostiantynivka, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, namely the M04 highway, passes through here. Russia's primary objective is to sever this artery. Looking at open-source intelligence data, the criticality of the situation becomes apparent. The Telegraph newspaper cites warnings from Ukrainian MP Oleksiy Honcharenko and independent analysis platforms such as Deep State. Russian advances have squeezed this vital supply route into a dangerous 5 to 10 kilometer bottleneck under fire control. Russian artillery can now target every Ukrainian supply convoy passing through this route. If Pokrovsk falls, this lifeline will be cut. Ukrainian forces in Kramatorsk and Sloviansk will find themselves under logistical siege. This is a full-blown strangulation scenario. Pokrovsk is the southern cornerstone of the defensive belt that Ukraine has been building since 2014, which the BBC has dubbed the New Fortress City. This belt starts in Pokrovsk, extends north to Minarad, and then to the final fortress belt triangle of Kostiantynivka, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk in the northeast. These cities are massive fortifications supporting each other. However, if Pokrovsk falls, the southern flank of this line collapses. This would allow Russian forces to flank the line and render the other strongholds indefensible. The loss of Pokrovsk is not just the loss of a city, it is a domino that could trigger the collapse of the entire Donbass defensive architecture. Looking at the map from a broader perspective, the scale of the danger becomes even greater. Pokrovsk and the surrounding ring of fortresses form a barrier trapping the Russian army in the Donbass mud. If this barrier falls, the way opens for an advance westward, toward the central Dnipropetrovsk region, the industrial heart of Ukraine. Pokrovsk is the last geographical and military obstacle to Russia's westward advance. Overcoming this obstacle could change the geography and nature of the war. In addition to its military and strategic importance, Pokrovsk was home to Ukraine's last major mine-producing coking coal, which is critical to Ukraine's steel industry. The loss of this mine would deal a heavy blow to Ukraine's war economy and long-term reconstruction capacity. Ultimately, this is why Putin sacrificed 25,000 troops. Pokrovsk is the key to Russia winning the Donbass. For Ukraine, it is the last bastion of not losing Donbass and not bringing the war to the center of the country. The fate of the war is being decided at this critical crossroads. The Russian offensive doctrine had to evolve in Pokrovsk. The mechanized fist tactic, which became bait for FPV drones, collapsed. The subsequent human wave tactic failed in October with the disappearance of 25,000 soldiers. When the Russian command couldn't break through the front line, it began trying a third approach: infiltrating. This was Russia's new and, it believed, ingenious infiltration tactic. An analysis of this tactic's anatomy, according to OSINT rules, suggested another fiasco was in the making. ISW's reports dated November 8th and November 9th detail this new tactic. Russian forces organized themselves into small, mobile groups of 2 to 3 people. These groups did not carry heavy weapons or armored vehicles. Even more worrying was that most of these soldiers wore civilian clothes to avoid detection, violating international laws of war. The scale of this tactic was also not to be underestimated. President Zelensky mentioned 314 Russian soldiers attempting to infiltrate the city in this manner, and the Telegraph confirmed this number to be approximately 300. This was a secret army on the front line. According to ISW's analysis, their goal was not to capture the city or hold an area permanently. The goal was to create internal front chaos. These ghosts in civilian clothing would ambush Ukrainian logistics lines, sabotage supply routes, spread panic within the city, and most importantly, place mortar and drone operators in the city's buildings to provide target coordinates for Russian artillery and drones. However, Ukraine had prepared a countermeasure against this insidious plan. In response to the Russians' infiltration tactic, Ukraine turned Pokrovsk into a giant death trap. The Russians were allowed to enter the city to a certain extent, and then the door was closed behind them. The city became not a refuge for these infiltration groups, but a hunting ground. The most striking evidence of this hunting operation came on October 31st. The Ukrainian Military Intelligence Service, HUR, launched a special airborne operation to clear these groups that had infiltrated the city. According to reports, in this operation, allegedly led by intelligence chief Kirilo Budanov himself, Ukraine's elite units were dropped behind enemy lines into the areas of Pokrovsk infiltrated by the Russians. This was a hunter-killer operation launched to hunt down the infiltrators. The collapse on the propaganda front was not long in coming. Russian infiltration groups managed to briefly raise the Russian flag on the Pokrovsk City Council building for propaganda purposes. This was presented as a victory by Russian media. However, this victory lasted only hours. According to the ISW's November 6th report, Ukrainian forces immediately recaptured the building, cleared it, and established control. This was an embarrassing testament to how superficial and fragile Russian infiltration attempts are. However, the strongest evidence proving the failure of the infiltration tactic came not from a Ukrainian report, but from a Russian propagandist. Famous Russian war blogger Boris Rogin was forced to admit the bitter truth from the front lines. Rogin stated, "UAVs, Ukrainian UAVs, are monitoring all access routes, and only the bravest can overcome this barrier alive." This is the moment of confession itself. The Russian side has admitted that, due to Ukraine's technological surveillance, the infiltration tactic has turned into a suicide mission. Ultimately, what we witnessed in Pokrovsk is the defeat of mass against innovation. Russian commanders believed dense fog would stop FPVs. Ukraine responded with thermal cameras. The plan the Russians thought was ingenious turned into a tragedy because it was technologically inadequate. The 25,000 casualties in October are the price of this technological asymmetry and the failure of Russian doctrine. Pokrovsk is a demonstration of how Putin's Donbass objective was destroyed by the harsh realities of the 21st century. So, what are your thoughts on this? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.